The most terrifying sound I ever heard wasn't a gunshot or a crash. It was my doorbell at 1 o'clock in the morning, followed by the words, "Police open up, you're under arrest." What would you do if your HOA president and her two friends dressed in fake cop costumes tried to kidnap you from your own home over an approved fence color? The footage of what happened next ended up on the news, but the real story, the one you're about to hear, is so much crazier. Trust me, these fake officers regretted the day they ever messed with my family. Tell me in the comments below, what's the worst neighbor drama you've dealt with? After 7 years of saving every penny, I finally held the keys to my first home. I was 30 years old, and I had spent those years eating ramen noodles more nights than I care to admit. I work in computer security, which means I know how to research things properly, leaving no stone unturned in my search for information, and I am meticulous about details. So when I decided to paint my fence, I knew I had to be careful. I spent weeks combing through the HOA guidelines to make sure I was in the clear. I was meticulous, making sure I didn't miss anything that could possibly get me into trouble later on. I printed out the approved color list and took it to 3 different paint stores to make sure I got the exact shade. The color I chose was called Forest Sage, and it was number 42 on their official approved list, right there in black and white for everyone to see. I even kept the receipt and photographed the color code because something in my gut, some kind of instinct, told me I might need proof of my decision later, anticipating a potential conflict. I spent my entire weekend painting that fence, making sure every single board was perfect and evenly coated without any streaks or imperfections that an inspector might find. The weather was perfect with no wind or rain threatening to ruin my hard work, and my neighbors were walking by complimenting how professional it looked and how good the color was. A neighbor from 2 houses down even stopped to ask what color it was, saying she wanted to use the same one for her own fence in the spring. I was actually so proud of how it looked, standing back and thinking I'd finally made it as a real homeowner, a perfect picture of suburban bliss and independence. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment and peace, which would soon be shattered in the most ridiculous and unexpected way. The fence looked stunning, and I proudly took a few photos. Monday morning arrived, and I was having my coffee on the front porch when I saw this woman marching across the street with a clipboard clutched in her hands like it was some kind of weapon. Megan Richardson, our HOA president, didn't need an introduction. She was the enforcer of every petty rule in our neighborhood. She had this purposeful stride, like a prosecutor heading to deliver a death sentence to some poor soul who had violated an obscure city ordinance. I could tell from the way she held herself that she was about to ruin my morning and probably my entire week. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, and she wore these reading glasses on a chain like she was perpetually ready to inspect something and find it lacking. She knocked on my door with the kind of authority that makes you think maybe you forgot to pay your taxes, a series of hard, aggressive raps that demanded immediate attention and a quick response. She didn't wait for me to say anything. She just announced, "This color is too bright for our community standards. It disrupts the neighborhood harmony and violates our aesthetic guidelines." Her voice cold and completely devoid of any friendliness or warmth. I held up the printed guideline pointing directly to the exact color code. But the look on her face told me she wasn't listening. "Ma'am, this is Forest Sage number 42 on your approved list. I have all the documentation right here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though I could feel my frustration building. But Megan just smirked at me like I was some kind of naive child, like my research and my documentation were completely irrelevant to her authority and decision. That smirk told me everything I needed to know about what kind of person I was dealing with. "Rules can be interpreted differently based on community impact and board discretion," she said, tapping her pen against that clipboard as if she were a judge delivering a final verdict, her words dripping with condescension. "I'm the one who decides what's appropriate for this neighborhood," she said with a chilling finality that left no room for debate or discussion and made me feel like I had no rights at all in my own home. And that's when I realized this wasn't about the fence anymore. This was about power. She needed to establish dominance, and I had somehow become her target through no fault of my own. What happened next was like watching someone conduct an orchestra of petty tyranny, a full demonstration of what she was capable of when challenged by someone who dared to follow the rules correctly. Megan started a full property inspection, right there on the spot, pulling out a measuring tape like she was preparing for surgery on my home. Her eyes narrowed in concentration, looking for any flaw she could find. She found that my mailbox was 2 inches too tall, took photographs of a single dandelion growing near my sidewalk, like it was evidence of criminal negligence, and documented that my trash can was 6 inches from what she called the designated collection zone. I started digging into Megan's past, expecting to find her weaknesses. I knew that gathering the right information would be crucial for what came next. What I found made my blood run cold and explained everything about her behavior because I discovered she had a documented history of this kind of thing. There were bankruptcy records from 3 years ago, when she lost her small business due to poor financial management and customer service failures, a pattern that had clearly been ongoing and now showed a clear progression in her behavior. The court documents painted a picture of someone who couldn't handle criticism or failure. She'd had to sell her previous house to pay off debts and had moved here for what she called a fresh start after ruining her old one. But there was so much more to her story. Bad business reviews going back 5 years, with customers complaining about her being controlling and impossible to work with, a recurring theme that explained her personality perfectly. I even found complaints from neighbors at her previous address in Texas, including one restraining order filed by someone who claimed she'd been harassing them over property issues. This woman had a pattern, and I was apparently her newest victim in a long line of people she'd terrorized. The violation notice arrived 3 days later by certified mail, and I actually had to read it twice because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The fine was $1,300 for multiple property violations, including improper color selection, mailbox height, infraction, weed, maintenance, failure, and waste container positioning error, a list that seemed completely made up and ridiculous. $1,300 for a fence color that was literally on their approved list, a mailbox that was 2 inches too tall, one dandelion, and a trash can that was slightly out of position. The fine notice also included threatening language about escalating penalties and potential legal action if I didn't comply immediately. I could feel everything I'd worked for slipping through my fingers as she dismissed my proof, but I wasn't going to give up yet. The violation notice also mentioned that failure to pay within 15 days would result in additional daily fines of $200 plus potential liens against my property and forced compliance measures. I stared at the document, realizing that this wasn't just harassment anymore. This was financial warfare designed to either bankrupt me or force me to submit to her arbitrary authority completely. As I held that $1,000 fine and read through the threatening language about escalating penalties and legal action, I couldn't help but wonder if this woman was insane or just purely evil. Was I about to be crushed by the weight of her arbitrary fines, or would this ridiculous fine be the spark that ignited a fire inside me, forcing me to fight back in a way I never thought possible? I stared at that fine for about 10 minutes before I realized I had two choices that would define not just this situation, but probably the rest of my time in this neighborhood. I could pay the $1,300 and let Megan know that I was someone who could be pushed around, or I could call the one person I knew who never backed down from a fight. The choice wasn't really that difficult once I thought about it that way, and realized I would not be defeated by her, even if it meant a difficult confrontation. I called Max and he said he'd be there in the morning. My cousin Max had always been the guy in our family who stepped up when things got serious. He was 36 years old, a former Army Green Beret who'd served 3 tours overseas, now working as a security consultant for businesses that needed someone who knew how to handle difficult situations. But I could hear the readiness in his tone when he spoke to me on the phone. "And Mia, don't pay that fine," he instructed me, knowing that paying it would be a sign of weakness to someone like Megan. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing he was on my side, and that I was not alone in this fight against her. While I was waiting for Max to arrive, Megan decided to escalate things to a whole new level of petty tyranny. Megan called an emergency HOA meeting, sending notices to all 28 residents. The subject line on the email was, "Protecting our community standards from violations," and she'd attached a PowerPoint presentation with photos of my house circled in red. Arrows pointed to my mailbox, and close-up shots of that single dandelion were presented like evidence in a murder trial, a performance of legal authority she did not possess. She even included a slide titled, "The Domino Effect of Allowing Violations," that suggested if we let one person break the rules, the entire neighborhood would descend into chaos and property values would plummet. The presentation included charts, graphs, and what appeared to be legal citations that I was pretty sure she'd made up, to add a sense of official importance to her theatrical argument. Looking back, I still can't believe she put that much effort into trying to destroy me over a fence color, an approved one at that. The meeting was held in the community center, and I watched neighbor after neighbor file in to hear Megan's presentation about the dangerous criminal living among them, who had dared to paint her fence an approved color, a complete fabrication. There was Bob Wilson, 64 years old, a retired bookkeeper who lived alone and always seemed nervous whenever Megan was around, never able to meet her gaze directly. Carol Thompson was there too, 45 years old, unemployed since her divorce, and always walking around looking for someone to gossip with, a perfect pawn for Megan's game of power and influence. It didn't make sense at the time why people who'd been perfectly normal neighbors were suddenly treating me like a pariah, but I was starting to understand that Megan had been working on people behind the scenes. Max arrived during the meeting and found me sitting in my kitchen, feeling pretty sorry for myself, completely defeated by the situation. I was at my lowest point, wondering how I was going to get through this. But instead of giving me a pep talk, he just grabbed his phone and walked outside without saying a word, already in professional mode. I watched through the window as he positioned himself in the parking lot, where he could see and hear everything happening inside the community center. He was recording the entire presentation, taking notes, observing how people were reacting, gathering intelligence just like he had been trained to do in the military. After everyone left, Max came back inside with this thick folder he had apparently put together while I was wallowing in self-pity. "All these rules and fines are just intimidation tactics," he explained, spreading documents across my kitchen table like he was planning a military operation. He told me that tomorrow we were going to show Megan what real strategy looks like. He didn't just agree to help. I could hear him already mapping out the legal attack in his head. "I'll have everything in place by tomorrow. This ends now." He'd already contacted a civil rights lawyer who specialized in housing discrimination and HOA abuse cases. He'd filed formal complaints with the state HOA Oversight Board, the County Housing Authority, and the State Attorney General's office. He had taken every possible step to counter her moves, anticipating her every action and planning for her escalation. He'd also requested a complete financial audit of our HOA funds under state transparency laws because he suspected Megan was doing more than just harassing residents about fence colors. Max had anticipated exactly this kind of escalation, and he was ready for it. The next morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, Megan announced a special monitoring period for my property, which meant daily inspections and potential fines up to $400 per day for any new violations she could find or invent. But Max had prepared a formal response that cited specific state laws about HOA authority and enforcement procedures, a response she wouldn't be able to ignore. "She's been charging fines that exceed state legal limits," he said, "and she hasn't followed proper notification procedures for any of them," he explained, showing me the thick folder of research, again proving that every single step had been thought out and documented. Max smiled, that calm, confident smile that had probably terrified enemy combatants in 3 different countries. "Don't worry, Mia. Tomorrow we start fighting back with real rules, real laws, and real consequences. Megan is about to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong family," he said. But even as I trusted Max, something in my gut told me Megan was only just getting started. And this wasn't going to end the way I hoped. Looking at Max's determined expression and the stack of legal documents he'd prepared, I realized I had 2 choices: trust his plan completely or watch my dream home slip away forever. Max wasted no time setting up our counterattack. What he launched over the next 72 hours was a complete military-style operation designed to systematically dismantle Megan's entire power structure and expose her pattern of abuse to everyone who had the authority to stop her. I watched him work for 3 days straight, and it was like watching a master chess player who could see 20 moves ahead, anticipating every counter move and preparing for it in advance. My initial feeling of defeat was being replaced by a glimmer of hope as I saw his methodical approach to the problem. He didn't just contact one lawyer and hope they'd take the case seriously. Max contacted a civil rights attorney ready for a case like this. He didn't just file a complaint with one agency. He filed formal complaints with the state HOA Oversight Board, the County Housing Authority, the State Attorney General's office, and the Federal Housing Discrimination Office, each one documenting a different aspect of what was clearly a pattern of illegal behavior. He was building a mountain of evidence that would be impossible for her to ignore. But the move that really impressed me was when he organized a Know Your Rights workshop for our neighbors, completely taking the narrative back from Megan's control. He reserved the same community center where Megan had held her anti-Mia presentation, and he invited a real estate attorney, a representative from the State Housing Authority, and a civil rights advocate to explain exactly what HOA boards could and couldn't legally do to residents. He sent professional-looking invitations to every house in the neighborhood, complete with an agenda and information about free legal consultations. 15 people showed up, which was more than half our community. And these weren't just people who were curious about legal technicalities. These were neighbors who'd been living in fear of Megan's arbitrary enforcement, people who'd been paying illegal fines and accepting harassment because they didn't know they had rights or legal protections. Max was providing them with the tools they needed to fight back, and the relief in their faces was palpable. I watched people's faces as the attorney explained that many of the rules Megan had been enforcing were actually illegal under state law. Bob Wilson looked like someone had just told him he'd been paying taxes on a house he didn't actually owe taxes on, because apparently Megan had been charging him monthly inspection fees that weren't authorized by the HOA bylaws or state law at all. Carol Thompson kept shaking her head and muttering, "I didn't know that. How was I supposed to know that?" The elderly woman from across the street started crying when she learned that the $500 fine she'd paid for having non-conforming garden decorations was completely illegal. It was like watching a spell being broken for all these people. One by one, people started coming forward with their own stories about Megan's bullying and illegal enforcement tactics, a flood of shared experiences that made me feel less alone and more like part of a community united against a common enemy. The woman from across the street admitted that she'd been avoiding me because Megan told me you were causing trouble, and that anyone who supported you might be investigated for violations, which was a direct lie and a calculated move to isolate me. Bob revealed that Megan had been threatening to report his suspicious Amazon deliveries to authorities if he didn't support her decisions. Max also contacted an investigative reporter from the local newspaper who had written stories about HOA abuse in other communities, providing her with a wealth of information. He provided her with detailed documentation of Megan's harassment pattern, copies of the illegal fines she'd been issuing, recordings of her threats and intimidation tactics, and financial records showing that she'd been charging fees that exceeded legal limits. The reporter was fascinated by the case because it illustrated every type of HOA abuse she'd been investigating in one single compelling story, an entire catalog of criminal behavior. Megan's response to all this legal pressure and community education was exactly what Max had predicted. She hired some sketchy private investigator to find dirt on both of us, hoping to discover criminal records or personal scandals she could use to discredit us. She also started spreading rumors that we were dangerous troublemakers with criminal backgrounds who were trying to destroy community standards and bring outside agitators into the neighborhood, a classic bully move that only served to make her look more desperate. But she was out of her depth in every possible way. The problem was, she was dealing with someone who had actual security clearance and a spotless military record, and someone like me who worked in computer security and knew how to document everything, verify information, and expose lies and misinformation. Every lie she told could be easily disproven with public records. Every threat she made was recorded and documented, and every illegal action she took was immediately reported to the appropriate authorities with proper evidence. This was a perfect counterplay that left her with no room to maneuver, and she was losing control in a very public way. The psychological pressure Max applied was surgical in its precision, designed to make Megan understand that her behavior had consequences and that she was dealing with people who wouldn't be intimidated. He sent her a certified letter every single day with new legal citations about her violations, each one completely professional and factual, but increasingly ominous about potential consequences. By day 7, Megan was pacing back and forth in her yard like a caged animal, and I could see her peeking through her curtains every time the mail truck came down our street. The breaking point came when Megan confronted me directly outside my house, screaming about harassment and threatening to have me arrested for causing trouble in the community. What she didn't realize was that Max was recording the entire meltdown from across the street with a professional camera, giving us perfect documentation of her making illegal threats while claiming to be the victim of the situation she'd created. She was screaming at me about my attitude problem and my refusal to respect community standards, and I'm standing there thinking, seriously, Did she really just threaten to have me arrested? 3 neighbors approached me privately that same evening to apologize for their behavior and share their own stories about Megan's systematic bullying. They also offered to testify about her pattern of abuse if we needed witnesses for legal proceedings, which was a huge turning point and a sign that the community was finally turning against her. Max had the facts ready, but it wasn't just about paperwork. He was gearing up for a fight. "She's showing classic signs of someone about to do something desperate and stupid," he said, and I knew he was right. As Max worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that Megan was about to make a dangerous move. We were on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. As I watched Megan pacing back and forth in her yard like a caged animal, I wondered, would she finally give up? Or was she planning something that would change everything Max had prepared me for? Exactly this type of escalation, creating detailed emergency protocols based on his assessment of Megan's psychological profile. But I still wasn't ready for what happened at 1:15 a.m. on a Tuesday night that would change everything about this situation. I was sound asleep when violent pounding started on my front door, like someone was trying to break it down with their bare hands. The sound was so loud and aggressive that I jumped out of bed thinking there was some kind of emergency, maybe a fire or a medical crisis that required immediate attention. "Police open up immediately. You're under arrest for multiple violations." The shouting was so authoritative that for about 5 seconds, I actually thought real police officers were at my door, maybe because of some misunderstanding or false report that Megan had filed against me. But something felt immediately wrong about the whole situation. Something that made my security training kick in, even while I was still half asleep and confused, a deep instinct telling me that this was not a legitimate situation. I checked the camera footage, 3 figures in police uniforms, but something didn't add up. I had to be sure. What I saw on the monitor made me realize this wasn't a police visit or an emergency response. This was something far more sinister and potentially dangerous. These weren't real officers conducting legitimate police business. These were people wearing costumes and playing dress-up in some kind of elaborate scheme that was probably illegal in multiple ways. They were holding official-looking papers and pointing at my door with authority. But the more I looked at the footage and listened to their shouting, the more obvious it became that everything about this was a performance. These were cheap Halloween costumes with wrinkled fabric and crooked badges that looked like they'd been bought at a discount store. The official badges looked like they were made from aluminum foil and cardboard, probably crafted during an arts and crafts session that would have embarrassed a middle school student. One of them was holding what appeared to be children's toy handcuffs from a costume store, the kind with bright plastic chains that couldn't actually restrain anyone stronger than a 5-year-old. Another one had a broken walkie-talkie that wasn't even turned on, holding it up to their mouth and pretending to communicate with headquarters using codes that sounded like they'd been learned from watching police dramas on television. And the arrest warrant they were waving around looked like it had been printed on regular copy paper with multiple spelling errors and formatting mistakes. I could see Bob Wilson nervously fumbling with those toy handcuffs, clearly having second thoughts about the whole operation, and looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world except standing on my porch at 1 a.m. wearing a fake police costume. Carol Thompson was holding that broken walkie-talkie up to her mouth, pretending to radio headquarters with increasingly ridiculous police codes that she was obviously making up on the spot, probably based on crime shows she'd watched on television. "This is Unit 47, requesting backup for a code red situation involving a hostile suspect." And there was Megan dressed in the most unconvincing police costume I'd ever seen, directing the whole charade like she was some kind of criminal mastermind orchestrating an elaborate heist instead of 3 middle-aged neighbors trying to intimidate someone with Halloween costumes. She was wearing a security guard uniform that didn't fit properly, with a badge that looked like it came from a cereal box and a hat that was obviously from a costume shop. I'm looking at this through my security camera recording everything, and I'm thinking, are they actually trying to arrest me with Halloween costumes and toy handcuffs? I hit record, then used the intercom to engage them, hoping the audio would capture every word. "Officers, can you please show me your badge numbers and tell me which department you're with?" I asked through the door speaker, trying to sound cooperative while actually gathering evidence of their deception. "I'd also like to see the warrant you mentioned, because I want to make sure I understand what this is about." Megan started shouting back immediately, obviously frustrated that I wasn't opening the door and submitting to their fake authority like they'd probably planned. "We don't have to show you anything. You're under arrest for multiple violations of community standards, and we have full authority to take you into custody," she screamed, her voice cracking with fury and a desperation that was audible and telling. "Since when do police officers arrest people for HOA violations?" I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the absurdity of the situation. But I also realized this was potentially very dangerous because these people had clearly lost touch with reality and legal boundaries and were willing to cross a serious line. When I refused to open the door and continued asking for proper identification, Megan became completely enraged. "You're resisting arrest. This is a felony, Bob. Break down that door right now," she screamed. Bob half-heartedly pushed against my solid oak door while Carol continued shouting, made up police codes into her broken walkie-talkie. The whole thing was so absurd that I started recording it with my phone just in case nobody would believe me later. It was a complete farce, a poorly staged play, but it was also a serious threat to my safety and home. When things spiraled, Max appeared calm and ready. I don't know how he got there so fast, or how he'd managed to approach without any of them noticing, but suddenly he was standing behind them in the darkness, a new character in their drama. Max recorded everything with his phone, capturing their mistake. His voice was completely calm when he spoke, but there was something in his tone that made all three of them freeze immediately, like they'd just realized they were in serious trouble. "Good evening, Megan. I think you and your friends need to step away from that door right now. And maybe we should talk about those interesting costumes you're wearing, and exactly what you think you're doing here at 1 a.m., he said, his voice even and controlled. I watched through the camera as all three of them slowly turned around to face Max, and I could see the exact moment when they realized their brilliant plan had just turned into the biggest mistake of their lives, because they were now caught in the act by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had the skills to stop them. Bob dropped those toy handcuffs and took a step backward, probably realizing for the first time that impersonating police officers was a serious crime with real consequences. Carol stopped pretending to use her broken walkie-talkie and started looking around for an escape route, completely panicked and ready to flee the scene. Max was recording everything in high definition. He was a credible witness to attempted kidnapping and impersonation of law enforcement officers, and he had the legal knowledge and military training to make sure they faced serious consequences for what they were doing. Standing there in the darkness, watching three grown adults realize they'd just committed multiple felonies while thinking they were enforcing community standards, I realized this moment would either save my home and end Megan's harassment forever, or completely change the course of my life in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Have you ever had to choose between opening your door to fake police or trusting your instincts that something was dangerously wrong? What happened next changed everything and sealed their fate forever. Max stood there with perfect military bearing, his voice controlled but absolutely authoritative in the way that only comes from years of handling dangerous situations with life or death consequences. Every question he asked was designed to expose their lies and get them to admit their crimes on camera using interrogation techniques he'd learned during his military service and refined through years of security consulting work. "Megan, can you show me your badge number and explain which law enforcement agency issued it to you?" he asked politely, holding his phone at the perfect angle to record both her response and the obviously fake badge she was wearing. She started fumbling with her costume badge, panicking about the fact that everything about her disguise was fraudulent. "Which police department issued this arrest warrant you're holding, and can you explain why it appears to be printed on regular copy paper with multiple spelling errors?" He continued, relentless in his pursuit of the truth. She couldn't answer that question at all because there was no legitimate answer to give a silence that spoke volumes about her guilt. "Bob, where exactly did you purchase those handcuffs, and can you explain why they appear to be plastic toys rather than standard law enforcement restraints?" Max's questions unraveled their lies quickly. "Carol, what radio frequency is that device set to, and which dispatch center are you supposedly communicating with using those codes?" The more questions he asked, the more obvious it became that they had absolutely no idea what they were doing, and had never considered that someone might actually challenge their authority or ask for proof of their legitimacy. Carol cracked first under the pressure, her voice shaking as she said, "We were just trying to scare her into compliance." Megan said it was perfectly legal to conduct a citizen's arrest for serious community violations. Bob panicked as the gravity of the situation hit. "She made us do this. I didn't know this was illegal. I just wanted her to stop bothering me about my deliveries." he cried out, betraying Megan and exposing her manipulative tactics. Megan tried to maintain the fiction, even as everything was falling apart around her, desperately clinging to some fantasy where she had legitimate authority. This is a legitimate citizen's arrest for serious property violations that threaten community standards. She insisted, her voice wavering with fear and desperation as she realized her plan was completely unraveling. But Max was ready for that argument too, because he had researched every possible legal justification she might try to use. He calmly explained that citizens' arrests were only legal for felonies committed in the presence of the person making the arrest, and HOA violations weren't felonies under any circumstances. He also explained that impersonating police officers was a federal crime. With up to 6 years in prison, attempted kidnapping was a federal felony with up to 20 years. And they were also looking at criminal trespass, harassment, and conspiracy charges that would be served consecutively, not concurrently. You know, I've heard crazy neighbor stories before, but this situation reminded me of something I once saw on QA stories about how bullies always reveal their true nature when they're cornered and realize their victims aren't going to back down. They either completely surrender and beg for mercy, or they double down and make everything worse for themselves. Megan had clearly chosen to double down, and it was backfiring spectacularly, a fatal error in her poorly conceived plan that was now destroying her life and the lives of everyone who had been foolish enough to follow her lead. Max continued his systematic demolition of their plan, explaining exactly how federal prosecutors would handle a case like this and what kind of sentences they could expect. "You have about 3 minutes to decide how you want this to end," he said, showing them his phone, which was still recording everything. "Federal prison uniforms for the next decade, or complete cooperation with an alternative resolution that might allow you to avoid criminal charges." He offered, his voice deadly serious and completely devoid of any sympathy for their situation. But Max had one more trick up his sleeve, a call to a reporter who'd been tracking HOA corruption, and now our story was about to go public. The crushing revelation came when Max told them he'd contacted real police before coming over, having anticipated exactly this kind of escalation from someone like Megan. "I called the real authorities 20 minutes ago when Mia texted me about fake officers at her door. They're on their way here now, and when they arrive, you'll have exactly one chance to explain why you're impersonating federal law enforcement officers," he warned, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I could hear sirens getting closer in the distance, and I watched all three of them realize the full magnitude of what they'd done to themselves. Years in federal prison, permanent criminal records, losing their houses to pay legal fees, complete social destruction when their mugshots appeared in the newspaper. Everything they had been trying to do to me was about to happen to them, except it was real and permanent. Carol started trembling uncontrollably. We only wanted to frighten her into repainting her fence. This was supposed to be just a warning, she cried out, her flimsy excuse completely inadequate for the situation they had created. Bob was begging Max not to press charges, promising to pay for everything, promising to never bother me again, completely losing his nerve and any semblance of the authority he'd tried to project. But it was Megan's reaction that really got to me, because she just stood there, staring at Max like she couldn't believe this was happening to her, a look of complete shock and betrayal on her face. Like she couldn't understand how her brilliant plan to terrorize me into submission had turned into her own nightmare, complete with federal charges and prison sentences and the total destruction of everything she'd been trying to protect. Max offered them one alternative to federal prison, but the terms were harsh and designed to ensure they'd never be able to hurt anyone else the way they'd tried to hurt me. Complete public confession to every resident, immediate resignation from all HOA positions, full financial restitution, restraining orders, and mandatory counseling. Choose now. I can hear sirens getting closer, and once the federal agents arrive, these options disappear forever. He warned them, his calm demeanor making the threat even more terrifying. Max's smile didn't reassure me. It made the air around us feel heavier. "This is just the beginning," he said, and I knew Megan's world was about to come crashing down. As I watched three grown adults realize their lives were about to change forever in ways they had never imagined, I couldn't decide. Should I feel sorry for them, or was the satisfaction of this moment of justice about to become the most profound feeling I had ever known? The terms Max offered them weren't generous or designed to let them off easy. They were brutal and comprehensive, designed to ensure complete accountability and prevent them from ever targeting another homeowner the way they'd systematized their harassment campaign against me. The first requirement was written confession letters to every resident admitting to criminal harassment, attempted kidnapping, and systematic abuse of HOA authority. This was followed by their immediate resignation from the HOA board, with a public admission of their illegal enforcement tactics. They also had to provide a full refund of all illegal fines, plus $3,000 additional compensation. The final terms included restraining orders, preventing any contact with me, and mandatory anger management counseling, at their own expense, a clear acknowledgement of their deep-seated issues. Watching them realize they had no choice but to accept these terms was like watching someone's entire world collapse in real time. Especially for Megan, who had built her entire identity around being the person in charge of enforcing community standards and controlling other people's behavior. The woman who had spent months trying to break me down with arbitrary fines now had to write letters admitting she was a criminal. But Megan wasn't ready to accept defeat. She tried to turn the tables, claiming that her resignation wasn't voluntary, but a political conspiracy against her. "This is harassment," she screamed at the neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. "I'm being targeted for doing my job and protecting this community from troublemakers who want to destroy our property values." Her desperate attempts to maintain some shred of authority only made her look more unhinged and pathetic, because everyone could see the evidence of what she'd actually been doing to people for years. The confession letter Megan had to write was particularly humiliating because it had to be specific, detailed, and personally delivered to every single house in the neighborhood, a public spectacle of her own making that she could not escape. She had to own up to every single lie she had told, every piece of misinformation she had spread, and every illegal fine she had issued to her own neighbors over the years. She had to sign it, copy it 28 times by hand, and personally deliver it to every house, knocking on doors and looking them in the eye. Some people slammed doors in her face. Others stood there and made her wait while they read the entire confession, asking questions about specific incidents that had affected them. A few neighbors actually laughed in her face, telling her they'd always known she was a bully, and that this was the karma she so richly deserved. Neighbors came forward, some with guilt in their eyes, others with relief. Megan had lost control, and they were finally ready to stand up to her, breaking free from years of intimidation and fear. The community reaction was immediate and devastating for all three of them. Neighbors were shocked and outraged when they learned the truth, but they were also relieved to understand that the harassment and illegal fines they'd been enduring weren't legitimate enforcement, but criminal behavior, a realization that freed them from a long-standing fear. Phone calls started flooding in from other residents sharing their own stories about Megan's systematic harassment and illegal enforcement tactics. People were furious that they'd been manipulated and intimidated for years by someone who had no legal authority. The illegal fines alone totaled over $12,000 that residents had paid to avoid continued harassment money that would now have to be refunded with interest and penalties. But more than the financial impact, people were angry about the psychological damage, the stress and fear they'd lived with for so long. Bob Wilson was so ashamed that he put his house on the market within 30 days and moved to another state to escape the social consequences. Carol Thompson became a complete social outcast, with even grocery store clerks avoiding her after the story spread. But it was Megan's total downfall that really satisfied my sense of justice, because she lost everything she'd been trying to protect through her harassment and control tactics, and it all came crashing down on her. Her husband filed separation papers the day after the confession letters were delivered, telling neighbors he'd had no idea about her illegal behavior and couldn't continue to be associated with someone who'd committed federal crimes against their own neighbors. She was forced to liquidate her retirement savings to pay the financial compensation, legal fees, and penalties. Criminal background checks prevented her from getting any new employment in our area because no employer wanted to hire someone who'd been convicted of harassment, extortion, and attempted kidnapping. The local news station picked up the story, and HOA president arrested for fake police impersonation became a viral video with over 2 million views in 1 week, turning Megan into a national symbol of HOA abuse and corruption. The transformation in our community was incredible once Megan's reign of terror finally ended. A new HOA board was elected within 6 months, composed of people who actually wanted to serve the community rather than control it. Property values increased 12% after her removal, because people actually wanted to live here again, and real estate agents started using our community as an example of successful HOA reform. The sense of community returned stronger than ever, with neighbors regularly gathering for block parties and looking out for one another in a way they hadn't in years. Have you ever had to choose between backing down from a bully or fighting back even when the stakes were high? But 6 months later, I was hosting a community barbecue around my beautiful sage green fence when an elderly neighbor, Mr. Martinez, revealed something that changed my entire understanding of the situation. "I recognized Megan immediately when she moved here," he told me quietly, but I kept quiet hoping she had changed. "She pulled the identical scam in Arizona before moving here." As Megan and her followers faced the community, their past crimes laid bare, I realized this wasn't just about victory, it was about watching someone's entire world crumble. Max's investigation into Megan's background confirmed Mr. Martinez's shocking revelation and revealed something even more disturbing than I'd imagined when this whole situation started with a simple fence painting project. She had a documented criminal pattern across 4 different states, each time using slightly different tactics, but following the same basic strategy of infiltrating HOA boards, systematically harassing homeowners, and moving on when legal pressure became too intense. Her history included fraud charges in California, where she'd fled before trial, and fake police impersonation in Arizona, which resulted in her being banned from the entire county. She also had an HOA abuse lawsuit in Texas, where she was found liable for emotional distress and illegal fine collection, forcing her to relocate. And now, in our state, she was facing federal charges for a pattern of interstate fraud and impersonation. The FBI became involved once they realized they were dealing with someone who crossed state lines repeatedly to commit the same types of crimes, making it a federal matter under interstate commerce and civil rights statutes. Federal agents interviewed me, Max, and several neighbors, building a comprehensive case that would put her in federal prison for years. During my interview, one agent told me they'd been tracking similar cases and suspected there were dozens of other victims who hadn't reported their experiences. My willingness to fight back, combined with Max's military expertise and systematic documentation, had helped expose a much larger pattern of criminal behavior that affected hundreds of families. The agent explained that most victims of HOA abuse don't report it because they don't realize it's criminal. They're afraid of retaliation, or they assume HOA boards have legal authority they don't actually possess. I didn't have time to dwell on the past. With the case behind me, I turned my focus to what came next, ensuring no one else had to go through what we did. A year after the midnight incident, my life had completely transformed in ways I never could have imagined. I started an HOA abuse defense blog to help homeowners nationwide recognize harassment, understand their legal rights, and fight back against corruption. The website got over 60,000 visitors per month from people dealing with similar situations, and the advertising revenue was enough for me to help victims for free. Max and I weren't just running a business now, we were building a movement helping families take back control of their homes and lives. Turns out there was huge demand for someone who knew how to handle bullies with fake authority, document illegal behavior properly, and navigate the legal system effectively. We were booked solid for 6 months, with clients who needed help dealing with corrupt HOA boards and illegal enforcement practices. Our combined skills made us a formidable team that could take on even the most sophisticated harassment campaigns. The first annual Homeowner Rights Day block party was held around my beautiful sage green fence, covered by local media as a model for neighborhood empowerment. Over 200 people attended, including representatives from the State Housing Authority, civil rights organizations, and law enforcement agencies, learning to recognize and prosecute HOA-related crimes. Property values in our community had increased 20% over the year, not just because of improved management, but because our neighborhood had become known as a place where residents stood up for each other. But the most satisfying moment came when I received an email that changed everything again and showed me just how big this problem really was. The subject line read, "Emergency help needed," and the message was short but terrifying. Megan Richardson just moved into our neighborhood in Oregon and started harassing residents with the same exact tactics you described in your blog. "We found your website and desperately need help. Can you and Max come here? I looked across our new office space at Max, and we both knew this was bigger than just helping individual families. We were building a nationwide movement of homeowners who refused to be intimidated by petty tyrants masquerading as legitimate community management. We were documenting patterns of criminal behavior training, law enforcement agencies helping prosecutors build cases, and teaching families that they had rights that couldn't be taken away by bullies with clipboards. Max and I loaded up our consulting company vehicle and drove toward Oregon, knowing we were about to help more people understand their rights and fight back against systematic abuse. The fence that almost destroyed my life had become the symbol of my strength and the inspiration for a movement spreading across the country, helping thousands of families stand up to harassment and abuse. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened, not just to you, but to everyone whose life you touch afterward. We weren't just fighting individual battles anymore. We were changing the entire system and creating legal precedents that would protect families for generations to come. Just when I thought it was over, an email arrived from another neighborhood. Megan was on the move again this time, targeting someone much bigger. The message included photos of a massive suburban development and a desperate plea for help that sent chills down my spine. She's not just going after individual homeowners anymore, the email continued. She's infiltrated the management company that oversees 12 communities with over 3,000 families. That's how a simple green fence sparked a nationwide movement for homeowner rights and community empowerment. So, when bullies come for you, what will you do? Will you back down, or will you paint that fence even greener? Let me know in the comments.
From the whispers to the wreckage, QA Stories brings it all. Click that next video, if you can handle it.